A severed head can remain conscious for several seconds after decapitation. The eyes may blink, the lips might twitch. Awareness lingers even as life slips away. For Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII and the most infamous of England's executed queens, this grim scientific fact casts a terrible light on her final moments. Her death was not swift, nor merciful. It was a slow unmaking of body, mind, and memory, an execution crafted as theatre, meant to destroy not only her life but her legacy. Yet to understand the horror of her final mourning, one must first remember the brilliance of her rise. Anne Boleyn had not been born to be queen. She was a clever, ambitious young woman who returned from the French court with polished manners, quick wit, and a dangerous charm that could ignite obsession. Henry VIII was bewitched first by her intelligence, then by her refusal to yield. She denied him for years, demanding not to be his mistress, but his wife, and in doing so, she altered the course of England itself. To possess her, Henry broke from the Roman Church, defied the Pope, and declared himself head of the Church of England. Priests, nobles, even the very order of faith bent beneath his will, and at the centre of it all stood Anne. On the 1st of June, 1533, she was crowned Queen of England in a glittering ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Trumpets sounded, tapestries fluttered, gold cloth shimmered under sunlight. The woman who had once walked behind the Queen now walked before all England. But triumph, in Tudor England, was a brief and dangerous thing. Henry's passion, once volcanic, cooled into frustration. Anne bore him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. Miscarriages followed. Her sharp tongue and proud spirit, once alluring, began to grate against the king's pride. The same courtiers who had once flattered her now whispered of witchcraft, of arrogance, of disobedience. Even the people who had once cheered her began to turn, calling her the concubine queen. Behind the scenes, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's calculating minister, saw danger and opportunity. Anne had become too powerful, too outspoken, and her political influence threatened his reforms. The king's disappointment became Cromwell's weapon. He began to weave a net of accusations. Adultery, incest, treason. Names were gathered. Witnesses persuaded. Facts twisted until lies took the shape of truth. By May of 1536, the trap was sprung. Anne was arrested while dining in her chambers at Greenwich. She was taken by barge to the Tower of London, the same fortress where, only 3 years before, she had prepared for her coronation. The same cold stones now awaited her as a prisoner. Witnesses said that as she entered through Traitor's Gate, she fell to her knees and laughed, a brittle, broken sound that echoed off the water. Whether it was madness or courage, no one could tell. For 17 days, Anne lived in limbo. She was questioned repeatedly, denied any chance of appeal. The king avoided her name entirely, as though she were already dead. Yet the cruelty went further than the confinement. Her execution date was set, then postponed, then set again, each delay, another twist of the knife. Hope and despair alternated until even the concept of time lost meaning. Henry, in a gesture often described as mercy, ordered an expert swordsman from Calais rather than the usual English executioner with an axe. The decision was practical but cruel. It meant Anne would face death at the hands of a stranger, in a foreign style, before a foreign blade. The French method required her to kneel upright, without a block, trusting that the executioner would strike true. It was a show of precision, cold, theatrical, perfect for a king who wanted both spectacle and order. Inside the tower, Anne's composure astonished her captors. She prayed, she sang hymns. She even joked, saying she would be known as Queen Anne without a head. But beneath this strange calm lay exhaustion and trauma. Modern psychologists might call it dissociation. The mind separating itself from unbearable reality. Each night she knelt in prayer before flickering candles, seeking forgiveness for sins she did not commit. The silence of the tower pressed in around her. Through the narrow arrow slits, she could hear London breathing the river's low murmur, the distant tolling of bells. Somewhere out there, Henry was already preparing for marriage to Jane Seymour, her quiet and submissive lady-in-waiting. Those final days were not simply imprisonment, they were ritual humiliation. The tower's servants, once deferential, now avoided her gaze. Courtiers who had once bowed low now came only to confirm orders. Everything she had built, the courtly splendor, the alliances, The glory of her queenship was being dismantled before her eyes. On the evening before her death, Anne requested the sacrament at 2 a.m. She received it with trembling hands and whispered confession until dawn. When sleep refused her, she spoke softly to her ladies, comforting them rather than herself. Witnesses said she laughed often, not from joy, but from disbelief. By the time the lieutenant of the Tower arrived to inform her that the execution would take place the next morning, Anne had achieved an unnatural serenity. She was ready, she said, and only prayed that God would forgive those who wronged her. The night ended in the same chamber where her coronation robes had once been laid out. Candles burned low. Outside, the river carried the first light of day. The Queen of England, once crowned in gold and adored by a nation, now waited barefoot upon cold stone, her crown replaced by a thin linen cap. Her final whisper to her maid was simple: "The king will have no more queens like me." And in that quiet truth, Anne was right. Tomorrow would not just end her life, it would begin her erasure. Dawn crept over the Tower of London like a pale ghost, soft and indifferent to the tragedy it was about to witness. It was the 19th of May, 1536, the morning Anne Boleyn would lose her life, and with it, her place in history. Inside her small chamber, Anne had not slept. The candles had burned low. The wax pooled around the base like spilled tears. She had spent the night in prayer, kneeling on the cold stones until her knees were bruised and her voice hoarse. At 2 o'clock she had received the Holy Sacrament, clutching the host so tightly that it left an imprint on her palm. She prayed not for deliverance, but for peace and perhaps for her daughter Elizabeth. When the lieutenant of the Tower arrived, Anne greeted him not with tears, but with a small, brittle smile. "Master Kingston," she said softly, "I hear I shall not die before noon, and therefore I will go to dinner, for I think not to eat much after." It was gallows humour, a defiance only the condemned can understand. The Tower courtyard was already stirring. Outside, the scaffold had been built upon Tower Green, an unusual choice, for the ground was sacred and executions of queens were rare enough to require special permission. The structure itself was small, scarcely 3 feet high, built deliberately low so that Anne would be closer to the crowd. Her death was to be a lesson, not a private act of mercy. As Anne dressed, she chose a simple gown of dark grey damask, the colour of mourning. Over it she wore a crimson kirtle and a small ermine cloak, the last echo of her royalty. Her ladies in waiting, pale and trembling, could barely tie her sleeves for weeping. When one of them broke down completely, Anne placed a hand upon her shoulder. "Do not trouble yourself, good friend," she said quietly, "for I am willing and ready to die, and in so good a cause." It was not entirely true. No one is ever ready to die. But Anne understood that her composure was all she had left. By mid-morning, the crowd had gathered. Nobles, courtiers, soldiers, and commoners stood in tense silence. The sunlight that filtered through the morning haze seemed too bright, too clean for what was about to happen. Henry himself was not present. He had ridden to Whitehall Palace at dawn, waiting for the signal that would confirm his freedom and his next marriage. When Anne emerged from the Queen's house, a hush fell. She was small and slight, but there was dignity in the way she carried herself. As she walked toward the scaffold, the sound of her rosary beads brushing against her gown was the only thing breaking the silence. Some women in the crowd wept, others crossed themselves. She ascended the steps with care, pausing to look upon the sea of faces before her. Once, those same eyes had adored her. Now they came to watch her die. The French swordsman stood to one side, his face expressionless. He had been brought from Calais days earlier, paid a great sum for his skill. He was rumoured to have practiced for hours on carcasses and sandbags to ensure a single, clean stroke. To the crowd, this was seen as mercy. To Anne, it was another performance death as spectacle, executed with foreign precision. At the top of the scaffold, Anne turned to the audience. Tradition demanded she speak. Her final words would be recorded, repeated, and twisted to suit the court's narrative. Yet Anne understood the game. She had lived her whole life in the theatre of power, and now she would die in it. "Good Christian people," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I am come hither to die, according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die. I will accuse no man, nor speak anything of that whereof I am accused. I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor more merciful prince was there never." It was a speech of submission, but those who knew her heard the defiance beneath it. By declaring herself judged by the law, not by guilt, she cast doubt on the justice of her sentence, a silent protest wrapped in obedience. Then she turned to her ladies. "Commend me to the king's grace," she whispered, "and tell him that he hath ever been constant in his course of advancing me." The irony hung heavy in the air. She removed her cloak and knelt upon the straw. Instead of resting her head upon a block, she knelt upright in the French manner, her hands folded, her eyes closed. One of her maids stepped forward and tied the blindfold around her eyes. Those watching said she began to whisper a prayer. "Jesu, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." The swordsman took 2 quiet steps backward. "Bring me my sword," he called suddenly to distract her, as was his custom. As Anne turned her head instinctively toward the voice, the blade flashed through the air. One stroke, a single, perfect motion, silence. Then the dull sound of a head striking the straw. For a moment, the crowd seemed frozen. A woman fainted. A man crossed himself. The ladies on the scaffold cried out in anguish. Those closest swore that Anne's lips still moved, forming words that only God could hear. The executioner lifted her head by the hair, showing it to the crowd, a ritual of completion. Blood dripped onto the boards. The face that had once captivated a king now stared unseeing into the sky. There was no coffin prepared. In the confusion that followed, her ladies were forced to find an empty arrow chest. They placed her head beside her body, wrapped them together in linen, and carried her to the chapel of Street Peter ad Vincula, where traitors were buried without ceremony. There, beneath the stone floor, they laid her to rest. No prayers, no epitaph, no royal insignia. As they left, one of the ladies looked back and whispered through tears, "God save her soul. She was the queen still." Outside, London's bells began to toll not in mourning, but in signal. At Whitehall, Henry received the news and smiled. Within hours, he was riding to Jane Seymour's home, preparing for a new wedding. Anne Boleyn's heart had stopped beating, but her death had only begun to echo. The axe and sword were only the beginning. In Tudor England, death was not the end of punishment. It was merely the first step in obliteration. For Anne Boleyn, her true execution began after the blade fell. Before her blood had dried on the scaffold, men were already at work rewriting her story. Her crest, once carved proudly above palace doors, was chipped away. Her emblems, the falcon crowned in gold, were torn from tapestries and burned. Portraits of her were removed from galleries, her likeness scraped from wood panels and replaced with those of Jane Seymour. Even her initials entwined with Henry's were chiseled off walls, leaving blank stone scars across the palaces they once ruled together. Henry had declared that Anne had never been his lawful wife, making her marriage void and her daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. The child, barely 3 years old, was stripped of her title, her servants dismissed, her rooms emptied of the fine clothes once fit for a princess. Court records show that the small girl's new wardrobe contained only coarse linen and plain gowns, a quiet punishment for being her mother's child. Meanwhile, those who had stood near Anne were scattered or silenced. 5 men had already died before her, among them her own brother, George Boleyn, accused of the unthinkable crime of incest. Their execution at Tower Hill had been brutal, the crowd stunned by the grotesque accusations. Yet their deaths were necessary to secure the illusion of Anne's guilt. In Tudor justice, truth mattered less than narrative, and the king's story always prevailed. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her destruction, set the tone for the propaganda that followed. Poems that had once praised Anne's wit and beauty were rewritten to mock her ambition. Chronicles described her as a seductress who bewitched the king into sin. Even foreign ambassadors, fearful of Henry's wrath, reported her guilt as fact. Within days, Anne Boleyn, the queen who had changed the course of English religion, was reduced to a cautionary tale about female pride and divine punishment. But the cruelty did not end with slander. The very manner of her death became part of Henry's theatre of power. He ensured that her execution was remembered not as an act of rage, but as one of mercy, boasting that he had sent for the best swordsman in France so that his wife might die quickly. It was a grotesque rebranding, brutality disguised as benevolence. In the weeks following her death, England's mood shifted. Some whispered that Anne had died a martyr. Others rejoiced that the witch was gone. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, tightened his control over the court. Yet even he could not escape the shadow of what he had done. Years later, when he himself was led to the same scaffold, He would recall the Queen's composure and whisper, "I am come hither to die as she did." For Anne's ladies, the trauma was unbearable. The women who had served her in life were forced to prepare her body in death, washing away the blood, wrapping her head and torso in linen, sealing the box with trembling hands. One of them, overcome with grief, left the court and entered a convent. Another was said to have screamed in her sleep for years afterward. The Tower's silence carried their memories like ghosts through the corridors. Henry, however, moved on without pause. The very next day, he became betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks, they were married. The speed of it shocked even his closest advisors, but Henry's conscience was untouched. The pageantry of a royal wedding replaced the spectacle of a royal death. It was as if Anne had never existed. Her erasure was so complete that, for centuries, even the site of her grave was forgotten. The small arrow chest that held her remains lay beneath the floor of Street, Peter ad Vincula, among the bodies of nobles, rebels, and traitors. No marker, no name. Just a queen buried among the condemned. Only in the 19th century, when restorations were made to the chapel, were her bones rediscovered delicate, slight, and unmistakably feminine. The workmen who found her noted that the neck vertebrae were cleanly severed by a single stroke. It confirmed what witnesses had said. The French swordsman had not missed. Anne Boleyn's story could have ended there, another forgotten casualty of a tyrant's will. But history has a peculiar way of reviving the voices meant to be silenced. Her daughter Elizabeth, once stripped of her title, would grow to become one of England's greatest monarchs. Under her rule, the kingdom would thrive in an age of power, poetry, and exploration. The child of the condemned queen would build an empire greater than her father ever imagined. It is one of history's bitter ironies that the daughter reclaimed the honor the mother was denied. Yet even Elizabeth rarely spoke of Anne. Perhaps the wound was too deep, or perhaps silence was the truest act of remembrance. Today, tourists at the Tower walk past the small memorial on Tower Green, reading Anne's name carved into stone. Few notice how quiet the air grows there, or how the sunlight seems to soften as it touches the spot where she knelt. 5 centuries have passed, but the ghosts of that morning remain. Anne Boleyn's execution endures not simply because it was tragic, but because it revealed how absolute power destroys what it cannot control. She was not merely killed, she was unmade. Her reputation dismantled, her memory rewritten, her identity dissolved into the machinery of monarchy. And yet, for all Henry's efforts, she was never truly erased. Her face still haunts portraits once thought lost. Her name is whispered in chapel prayers. And her story, retold again and again, continues to defy the silence meant to bury her. The horror of Anne Boleyn's death lies not in the sword's swift stroke, but in the chilling precision with which power dismantled truth itself. She was killed as a woman, condemned as a symbol, and remembered as a legend. Even now, standing upon the Tower Green where the grass grows thick and green, one can almost hear the echo of her voice, steady, calm, defiant, speaking across the centuries. "I am come hither to die," but history, at last, has allowed her to live.